All right, so now getting into how to do 3D text and things of this nature. So again, with these spots, like I said, 3D. If we're looking back at the let me pop open the one I just had open a minute ago, the CBS little NBC Sports thing here. Rewind this and pause it. So talking about integrating like more three-dimensionality into your stuff here. All of the stuff up till this point in this little intro here is all just two-dimensional stuff with some 3D in the background with some again some pieces and parts overlaid on top of it. Now, what I wanted to show was how to do things like this, like with the text. So the logos themselves brought in as two-dimensional pieces, but this has a little bit of dimensionality to it. So if you look in some of these text pieces that are split between the logo pieces and things of that nature like that, all of this has a little bit of text dimensionality on it is the idea. That's 3D text, right? Now, we've kind of talked about doing 3D in After Effects a little bit up to this point. And just to show that again, just remember 3D in general, when you're doing, we talked about this with a parallax assignment, where if you have a shape of some sort drawn out onto your timeline, and you take that shape and you turn on the 3D options for it, right? It allows you to move this thing around in 3 dimensions, right? That's the idea, is the 3D buttons. Remember, these 3D buttons allow you to turn a 2-dimensional object into a 3-dimensional object, right? But let me actually use a piece of text out here for this to show you the differences. Let me type out a piece of text here. So let me just do something really obvious, right? I'm just gonna type out something that says 3D text, and I'm gonna use my little character palette over here to increase the size of it and whatnot, just so we can see what it looks like. I'm gonna make it a little fatter. Just a word to the wise, obviously, if you go back to what I was just looking at, if you look at the font work on this stuff, fatter fonts, sans serif generally. I mean, you can use serif stuff, but I would use a slab of some kind, a slab font of some kind for this stuff. The thicker fonts usually do a better 3D rendering. They look better in general. Thinner fonts just don't have the kind of gratification factor that thicker fonts have. So I would pick a thicker font of some kind for this, would be a good idea. So obviously I've got this text inside here, and I could snug this up and all that other jazz. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it 3D. So remember, I've got my little draft 3D turned on, and I'm gonna click the little button for my 3D layer down here. Remember the switches and modes, you've got your 3D layer, right? And that turns your text 3-dimensional basic, okay? If I crank this sideways, just like you guys did with the parallax assignment, it allows you to move this thing forward and backwards in space, right? That's half the battle, okay? So what we've got here is 2-dimensional text inside a 3D environment, right? But what we've got to do here for this thing is turn this more 3-dimensional, okay? So what we're going to do here, and this is something that we didn't really get a chance to talk about too much before, because we were more concerned with moving things that were 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional space. After Effects actually has the option to create 3D geometry, okay? So all I've done here is create a piece of text, turn it to 3D mode. Now I've turned on my draft 3D. Remember draft 3D, if you turn this on, this draft 3D button kind of spares the rendering engine a little bit on your computer. I talked about that a little bit with the parallax class, that if your computer's having a hard time with some of this 3D stuff, and especially right now, this is going to be intense on your computer. I'm going to turn this on for starters, and then I'm going to turn it off whenever I want the full 3D effect. Okay, so leave these two buttons turned on for starters. What I did was drop down the transforms. Okay, so one thing that's kind of important here is, if you notice, when I click the 3D, the little 3D switch, okay, it opens up a bunch of options down here in my transforms. And we know this from before, but we haven't really messed with these options very much, right? So now that it's in 3D, again, I'm going to rotate on my y-axis here a little bit to make it a little more 3-dimensional. And then what I'm going to do is right down here where it says geometry option, this is grayed out, okay? Right here, this says change renderer, okay? Now, before I click that, I kind of want to talk about what renderer means, because I feel like people just go through this stuff and they don't explain why on this, and this is fairly important. So just so you know what you're talking about, a rendering engine, okay? This is 3D talk. When we work in from 2D space, which is traditionally where a lot of designers will work, into a 3-dimensional space like we're in now, what the computer has to do and what the software, what this piece of software, After Effects in particular, has to do is take this text and render it to screen. Now, what does that mean? Rendering just means the computer is painting that artwork on screen, okay, a little bit at a time. There are different ways for the computer, the software itself, After Effects itself, to handle that rendering process, okay? Two-dimensional is where it starts off at. By default, the software is meant to show things two-dimensionally. If I click Change Renderer, though, what this does is allow me to go in and change some different composition settings. Okay, now these are the basic comp settings. If you look, since when I click Change Render, it brings up the basic comp settings again. This is what I just set, the HD stuff. You don't have to worry about this, okay? Or the advanced settings. The 3D renderer is what we want here. Okay, so this 3D renderer is an actual rendering engine. This is a separate piece inside the software that actually determines how these graphics are shown on screen or rendered to screen, okay? Cinema 4D, if we choose that, okay, a whole bunch of stuff comes up. Now, Cinema 4D, if you're not aware what this is, I'm gonna digress for just a second because this is really important to know. Cinema 4D is a piece of 3D modeling software, okay? Cinema 4D is a standalone 3D modeling software and animation software that is used pretty widely in the field to make and model actual 3D models, right? Like if you look in the gallery section, this is like a pretty high-end thing that's used for architectural renderings, animations, like pretty realistic stuff, right? What is happening here is that After Effects, and Adobe in particular, right, they bought the rights to use this rendering engine. And this rendering engine is a separate piece of software that we can turn on, that when we snap this on, it actually changes the physical properties of how this stuff is shown on screen. It turns this stuff into real three-dimensional stuff, okay? Now, why you need to know this is like a lot of things, I was just talking about this earlier, that this is kind of pseudo 3D, okay? This is gonna allow us to do 3D, but only basically with text and a couple of other flat objects. This is just the thing that outputs that 3D to screen. It's not like we get to do a lot of elaborate modeling with this, but it is something that allows us to print 3D to screen. So all of the things we can do here, it allows us to do extruded and beveled shapes, reflections, curved footage layers, materials, environmental layers, pre-concept depth passes, and all kinds of good stuff here. Stuff that's disabled is the things that I can't do inside here, like blending modes and layer styles won't work on this, okay? So these are things that will work, these are things that won't work. I'm gonna click OK. So like, long story short here, now my text has a 3D rendering engine applied to it, okay? Now, what I've got is all this stuff now, these geometry options and material options that were grayed out before are now available, okay? So what I can do is drop these down. Now, there's all kinds of stuff in here, okay? There's tons of different options inside here in the transforms and the text options and all that different stuff. These are all just tweaks, okay? These are all just tweaks for the most part. Underneath here, there's material options to what this thing looks like when I get some lighting on it in a minute, okay? The first thing you need to do is establish some extrusion depth. So extrusion, if you're not a 3D modeling person, the people that have had 3D modeling classes, just a small aside, if you haven't taken any 3D modeling classes and you're in the design field, I would strongly consider taking some 3D modeling classes if you're going to go into the design field. 3D modeling is only going to become more popular in the future. So just an aside, all these terminologies come from that stuff like extrusion. Extrusion just means if we crank this slider here, if you look, it creates depth. We've extruded the text, and I can even rotate this text to show the extent of this extrusion, right? You can see it on both sides. Now, it's kind of hard to see because of the material options and the lighting options that I've got inside here right now, which I'm going to change in a minute. But now this is three-dimensional text. Right out of the gate with one click, we've got something similar to this, okay? Now, there's more bevels, and this is shinier and all kinds of different options I'm going to show you in a minute. But the basics are there, okay? And this is movable, right? The whole thing is that you can move this thing around in the canvas however you'd want and animate it, okay, with that three-dimensionality applied to it. Now, lots of other options in here, okay? For starters, this is a little bit hard to see, okay? So there are some things we would like to do right out of the gate to couple with this 3D text to make it more visible, okay? And I'm gonna introduce something new that we haven't really done before that is gonna come in really handy with some of the things that you guys are doing with these branding packages. So far, I've collapsed out my transforms on the screen here. Again, all the different stuff I'm gonna use here in a minute. I'm gonna play with some of this stuff in a second. But to help show it a little bit more here, I need some lighting in my scene, okay? So this is something we haven't really talked about too much, and this is crazy helpful for these effect style shots that we're gonna be doing here. Lighting, okay? Inside your layer options in here, okay? Remember, we've gone up here for a couple different things. We've gone up here, sometimes you can create solids with it. We've done cameras out of here. We've done shape layers, stuff like that. One of these things is lighting. Okay, so lighting is a really useful thing in After Effects. Lighting, we can actually add lights, pseudo three-dimensional lights to the scene to create ambiance for this stuff. So I'm gonna go ahead and do layer new light. Okay, now we got a lot of options here. There's a lot of options for lights. Now this also gets into some more three-dimensional stuff, which is why, and I recommend you take some 3D modeling classes. The types of lights we've got here, spotlight is the default. That's generally what you want. But we can get parallel lights. If you want more than one light that's gonna pull down in kind of a more circular look, we can do parallel lights. I can do a point light, which is like dropping an actual light bulb into the scene. Spotlight's obviously like a spotlight, right? It's a cone of light. Ambient light is just background light. If you just wanted some background light in the scene to change, that's an option as well. I'm gonna pick spotlight though, because this is the most dramatic. The color of the light, so you can do colored lights. Actually, this is pretty cool. Something that I can even show in a minute here. We can change the color of these lights, and just like lights in the real world, they'll blend together to form different colors and stuff like that. So you can do effects with lights even. The intensity of the light from 0 to 100% intensity. Cone angle, like how wide the cone of the light is. The feather, how much the light falls off on the edges. What kind of fall off you want, smooth, inverse, square. I'm actually gonna pick smooth for the fall off here. By default, there's no fall off on these lights, which doesn't look terribly realistic. Fall off is how quickly the light drops off from the edge, right? In the real world, obviously light doesn't stay persistent forever. We want it to fall off at some point. And this is just how far it falls off. Okay. But I do want cast shadows turned on for sure. Okay, cast shadows is the whole point of this. By default, the lights in After Effects don't cast shadows because they're trying to spare your rendering engine here. Some of the stuff I'm gonna be doing, and I'm a little worried here already, this is gonna conk out my computer because it was having some trouble this morning, but we'll see how it goes, okay? Generally, if your computer's having trouble, you can turn these shadows off until you need them, but I'm gonna go ahead and leave them on and see what happens here. So it's a lot of settings just to show some shadows and such. I'm gonna click OK. Now, by default, nothing's happening here, okay? The reason nothing's happening by default, I can see the light in here. I've got a light in this scene right here. I can even move it, okay? I can move this light around in my scene, and you can't quite see what this light looks like because I've got my draft 3D turned on. Now, I turned that on earlier to spare my computer a little bit when I was setting up the 3D stuff. That's the whole point of this button. The whole point of this button is that you can leave off all these fancy effects if your computer's having trouble with them, and then when you want to preview them, you can turn it back on. Okay, so I'm gonna turn on Draft 3D. And notice, okay, right off the bat here, we've got a more dramatic text effect. Check this out. My text right here. Now I'm actually changing the origin point of my light here. And notice how it's not illuminating my text all the way. That's because of the fall off that I turned on for this thing, okay? What I'm gonna do to better see this light, already we've got a more dramatic look and feel for this, right? I can even pan the light across this to sweep across. This is even an effect right now that I could do with this. If I wanted to just key in, drop down my little triangle here, go to my transforms, right? Turn on my transforms, drag my timeline. Let's say we take 2 seconds, and I can take this light and pass it across my text, okay, for an effect. That there, right out of the gate, is a pretty decent title effect. If I hit play on this, we've got the light goes through and pans across my scene and illuminates my text, and the shadows all play interactively across there. That's pretty slick. Okay, not exactly what I want for demonstration purposes, but you can at least see what this does. This allows you to create three-dimensional objects and really show those with some dimensionality inside here. Okay, now I'm gonna go ahead and kill these keyframes though, turn it back off to do a few more things inside here. So Remember with 3D, going back to the parallax stuff that we talked about before, with 3D inside After Effects, I would recommend you work in 2 views or 4 views. If you're familiar with 3D modeling programs, 4 views might really be useful. 2 views is sufficient, though, I feel like. 2 views horizontal is pretty good. If you choose 2 views horizontal, you can then pick, here's my active camera, and then my top viewport up here. You can even switch these. If I don't want top, I can change this to front or left or whichever you want. I'm going to leave it up top, though. And now if I select, I can now control my light, the distance of my light, the origin point of this light, okay? And now I can control a lot more from these 2 views what is being lit up. Now I'm actually going to change my light. I'm going to move it in here, and I'm going to rotate it so that it's illuminating my text a little bit better, okay? It's giving me trouble about this and warning me that if you do this, it's going to give my computer some trouble, but that's okay. There we go. So now it's illuminating this a little bit better, okay? I can see that 3D text a little more. And now I could even change if I wanted to in the lights themselves. There's all the different things inside here. I can change the point of interest, the position, the orientation, all the different lighting options, right? Like the intensity, if that's not bright enough. I can increase the intensity. I can increase the cone angle, right? All these different options inside here I now can control with this light facing my 3-dimensional text, okay? So I'm going to leave that in there. Just a little bit of a kind of a more dramatic look and feel there. So just to highlight some stuff, what I was talking about earlier, let me close this up and I'll get into some more 3D text options here. If you don't see all of these options, these material options, sometimes these by default don't show up when you're working on this stuff. A good keyboard shortcut is to hit A on your keyboard twice, okay? If you hit A on your keyboard twice, that brings up all of your 3D options here, okay? So for instance, I'm gonna go ahead and swap this back to 1 view. And I'm gonna start messing with some of these options here, okay? So by default, one of the things that's really important with your 3D text here, okay? So let me zoom on in this a little bit. By default, there's no beveling turned on this, and my material doesn't do a bunch of stuff by default to save my computer some resources. Generally, what you want to do is right out of the gate, you want to give this thing a bevel style. Beveling, if you look at the text that's in this ad here, this little bumper spot, most 3D text is going to have a beveled edge to make it a little bit softer, to make it feel a little more tactile, okay? It's not a hard edge, it's a little bit of a bevel. That option's available in After Effects right here, okay? So you can choose a bevel style. Generally, you're going to want a convex or concave. Depends on the look and feel, but a convex bevel is what you're going to want. And I can even increase the bevel depth here, just crank that way up to show you. There we go. Now I've got a lot softer edge on that text. So I can really transform this text with these basic options, the bevel depth, the extrusion depth, all that stuff. The big stuff's in the material options though, right? By default, this thing is turned cast shadows off. Generally what you want to do, check this out. Cast shadows off by default, turn them on, and look what happens here, okay? Check out like right here in the middle of this D. I'm going to turn these back off. By default, your text is going to look a little flat, right? Because it doesn't actually cast shadows, even on itself. That's something to save the rendering, right? To save the rendering in this program and save your computer. The shadows are off by default. So if you turn these shadows on, it definitely gives this text a lot more dimensionality. And if you've got anything behind it, this will now cast shadows on things behind it. You can actually have the text cast wide shadows behind here if you wanted to. Same thing with this, accepting shadows, accepting lights, reflections even. You can have this appear in reflections. And all of that stuff, reflectiveness, the ambient look, this is all 3D options inside here, okay? So things like specular intensity, like what do these things mean? I want to go through these real quick because if you're not a 3D person, this is going to be complete Greek to you. Ambient is the actual base color of this thing. And the base color of my text here is white, right? So, I mean, the nice thing is you don't have to stick with that. Like this thing reacts with whatever colors you've got set in here. If I choose red, right, it's gonna make my text red. But how much of that ambient red I've got, I can really dial in, okay, with this slider. The diffuse color, the ambient color is the light in the background. The ambient light in the scene, okay, is the ambient color here. Diffuse is the main color. If I crank my diffuse all the way down, okay, this determines how much of that diffuse pops in my actual 3D rendering. Okay, same thing, specular. Specular, so ambient is kind of like the dark areas, the ambient light in your scene. Diffuse is the main color. Specular is your highlights. So if I crank the specular up, there's lots more highlight and it looks more metallic, okay? Same thing with the metal look and feel on this. You can have this look more or less metallic. Look how much more reflective that is. Reflection intensity. Now, reflections in general, if I have other things inside the scene, if I turn my reflections up, this will reflect other objects I've got in my scene, like a mirror, okay? So there's a ton of things inside here. It's just a matter of you kind of determining the look and feel, and based off what else is happening in your scene is how you tweak all these settings to get it to look correct. And now what you can do is animate all this stuff. This stuff is now all open for animation, and even, like I said, to the point where you can do things like, I'm gonna go ahead and switch this back to 2 views. I'm gonna duplicate this light and just show you some interesting things you can do. Copy and paste, right? Or a good keyboard shortcut, Command D or Control D will duplicate something by default in After Effects. Let me move this light over a little bit and change its origin point or its focal point here. Okay, this is again where the light itself is pointing. I'm going to change that focal point a little bit, so we have 2 different places that this thing's pointing at. Okay, now I've got 2 different lights in my scene, and I just want to show you the kind of the versatility of this stuff. Let me change the direction of this one a little bit and rotate it. So I've got this facing the right way. Okay, so I've got 2 different lights pointing at this text. Just to kind of show you the versatility of this stuff, I'm going to go back to one view here. I'm going to change this first spotlight and go inside the lighting options here and change the color to blue. Okay, so I've got red text now with a blue spotlight on it. Now notice, right out of the gate, the colors start to blend, right? I'm going to go ahead and pop another color. On the second spotlight, I'm going to change this one to green. Okay, and now what we've got, if you notice, is a real blending of color. You can even zoom in here and see where the red and the green are blending here to make this kind of purpley color in the shadows with this stuff. And all this has to do with the intensity of the light as well. If I can turn down the intensity of some of these lights, this influences the color of the objects in your scene. And all this stuff, like I said, is open for animation. You can even do, you know, different colored lights and make different passes of these things inside your scene to do different styles of effect. As the light sweeps across, notice a different color comes in, right? So all of these things, these lights, the 3-dimensional text, the masking that we've done previously, all this stuff leads up to all this toolkit that you guys can use to make graphics that look similar to this kind of stuff, okay? So a lot of this looks complicated, but really all it is some basic 3D text with a little bit of reflection placed on it and some other things happening inside the scene. So there you go. That's kind of it. It seems, like I said, a fairly straightforward thing, but the things to remember, Draft 3D, if your computer's having trouble, you can turn this off and on, okay, to give yourself a little more dimensionality. Remember to turn on the 3D switches, and then inside your text, you've got all your different transforms, and hit AA on any piece of text to add these different material options to it, which is what really makes the thing 3-dimensional. Okay, and again, rendering is the same process and things that you've done previously. You're going to add it to the composition, add to render queue, and set all your different stuff up and render it out. So there you go. That's kind of what I want you to do is work with some of this 3-dimensional text in there if it applies to your stuff. Again, I know not everybody is going to have 3-dimensional text for their scene. This is just some extra things you can add in there if it calls for it as far as your branding goes. That's kind of the idea. But just to break it down one more time, just to see where we're at here. Remember, again, just I'm gonna pop open the tab here for the assignments, and we can jump into these. We're on assignment 9 now. Okay, so like I said, just kind of a base thing to get everybody thinking here. We're on assignment 9 now, and this is going to last 2 weeks. Like I said, this is going to be till the November 8th when you turn this thing in. But what I'm looking for out of this is a bunch of people, and from the previous assignments, I'm just going to go back through some of these and look at them. We had let me move this one down. We had the character animation that we set up and the parallax effect. If you guys can get those, and I know times are kind of crazy right now, and that's totally fine. If you can get those 2 assignments, the parallax and the character animations, up to date by next week, we can start talking about those in class. And some people have done some really, really great stuff with these. And I'd like to get a little bit of discussion going about those. What I'm going to do is I'm going to offer people the ability to talk about their projects during this time slot, like this, 9 o'clock till the end of class here. The ability to talk about your projects for extra credit. So it'll be kind of a show and tell type of thing. I'll have you pull up your project and give us a rundown of it, and I'll give you extra points. Essentially, what amounts to a whole discussion posts worth, which is 20% of your grade, of extra points if you show and tell some of your stuff. Not going to be required, but I'll give you some options for that. So start thinking about the next week of class. If you want to show off any of your projects, we can talk about some of that stuff. I'm going to be reserving this time slot more for collaborative and help and things like that in the future. So just letting you know what we're going to be doing from here on in. It's going to be mostly working with final projects. After we wrap up this project, we're going to be getting into a lot of working on stuff. And again, the ability, remember, don't forget, if you guys are having any trouble with this stuff, you can show up here to class. We're in the Scheidegger building over here, and there's lots of time for me to help you out in person if you need to. Usually there's nobody in class, so it's pretty safe. So just letting you know. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop off the recording here, and you guys can fire some questions at me if you have any. Turn that off.